Late October, the highways had that thin, metallic smell that comes when the night starts swallowing the day, and I drove out of the city before dawn, aiming for a series of bookings I'd made across 2 states. My first pickup was supposed to be from a small town called Marrow Ridge, right off County Road 14, the kind of place where the GPS warns you that service may be spotty. I needed the trip because I had been logging too many nights in hotel chains and wanted to sleep to the sound of trees instead of air conditioning units. I wanted to test the theory that getting off the grid made you feel human again. The plan was simple: 4 weekend trips to cabins and chalets, each stay different, each host vetted, each ride arranged through the app. What I did not expect was how often the person who showed up at my door, claiming to be the driver, would not be the face the app showed. The first morning, I parked on a gravel shoulder and walked up the short path to the cabin, the air sharp with pine resin, the deck boards cold under my shoes, and the sky a pale smear that melted into the horizon. The listing had promised a lockbox with clear instructions, a wood stove, and a thermos in the pantry, and the place matched the photos. A low cabin with a green tin roof, smoke threading from the chimney, and a sign nailed to a post that read, "Marrow Ridge Retreat." I thumbed the lockbox code, hauled my bag inside, and breathed the dry, dusty heat of an oven-warmed wood stove. The smell of burning cedar was comforting, like a blanket I had forgotten. At dusk, I heard the distant clap of tires on the main road and saw headlights outline a small SUV at the bend. Out on the deck, I cradled a mug, the metal warm against my hands, watching and listening for the knock of a legitimate driver. A man walked up the lane, a cap pulled low, a thermos in one hand. He smiled at me before I could ask anything. He said his name was Marcus, and that he had come to check on the generator. On the app, I had a name and a photo that did not match the man on the path. That was my first dissonant detail, small and plausible, the kind that at the time you can explain away. Marcus waved at me in a way that felt exactly like neighborliness, and I waved back, thinking nothing would come of a mismatch between an app and a face. I should have listened to the little tightening in my chest, or to the way the thermos seemed too silver, too polished for someone who supposedly checked generators for a living. The next morning, when I looked up the number I had called through the app, the listing owner sent a text that made the hair on my arms stand up in their system. I had spoken with the man who claimed a job he did not have. I sat on the floor with my back against the wood-paneled wall, the echo of his voice still in my ears, and felt suddenly as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I want to be very clear about who I am and why these details matter. I am someone who travels alone often, who prefers single rooms, early check-ins, and the plain geometry of a roadmap. My name is Claire. I am in my mid-30s, I work in freelance documentary production, and I have learned to trust lists. A host profile, a verified phone number, a license plate shown in a receipt. My work has trained me to look for patterns, to sketch timelines, and to ask authorities for documentation when an anecdote tips into something that might be dangerous. But I am also someone who rarely panics, who thinks in logistical steps when fear creeps in. I grew up with parents who taught me how to change a tire, how to make a fire, how to lock the back door even when someone looks friendly. I carry those lessons like talismans, but I also carry a stubborn curiosity that has landed me in uncomfortable conversations and in late-night coffees with strangers who had a story to tell. That curiosity is part of why I booked those 4 trips. It is also part of why I noticed the wrong faces, and why I kept a running list of small anomalies that would later add up to something bigger than coincidence. My backstory is not just a preface. It matters because it explains how I move through space, why I notice the texture of a doormat, and why I remember the smell of a thermos. As a child, I spent summers at a lake house where the road stopped and a dirt track led into pines. I learned to identify bird calls by the way an old man named Harold whistled at dawn. In college, I worked nights as a barista and learned the rhythm of people coming in late, their voices low, their secrets small. Those jobs taught me the value of routine and the danger of assuming a familiar rhythm means safety. When I started freelancing and traveling for shoots, I kept a spreadsheet with host names, emergency numbers, nearest sheriff office addresses, and I always screenshot the driver profile before I got into the car. That habit would save me more times than I expected. Later, after a near miss on a late ferry, I took a course in situational awareness and first aid, practical things I hoped I would never need. Those hours spent learning how to stay calm under pressure informed every decision I made across the 4 trips. When something felt off, I checked the app. When a driver introduced himself, I asked questions. Those questions led to conversations, and conversations led to the slow realization that a thread connected these moments across states and cabin stays. My trips were booked over the course of 6 weeks, each weekend a separate story. The first was Merrow Ridge, the second a cedar chalet near Hollow Creek, the third a tiny A-frame perched above Old Mill Road, and the fourth a shoreside cabin by Lake Brant. The pattern was boring at first. Arrive, check in with the host, make a pot of coffee, sit on the deck, write for an hour. But in 3 of the 4 cases, someone showed up claiming a role the app did not record. Each instance was different in tone and in small detail, but the sum of them felt like a map dotted with pins connected by a thread. In Merrow Ridge, it was the man with the thermos and the generator story. In Hollow Creek, it was a driver who offered me a handwritten map to a secret trail. In Old Mill Road, a woman said she drove for the app but referenced trips on a calendar that did not exist. In Lake Brant, a young man arrived in a pickup, insisted he had been sent by the host, and asked to use my phone to call his sister. All of these interactions were plausible in fragments, but when I compared notes, times, and the messages in the app, I realized I had been collecting a set of cues that pointed toward a pattern I could not ignore. Block 1 of my trips, Merrow Ridge, is where the story begins and where the voice settles into a rhythm of arrival and first impressions. The date was October 19, and the road that led up to the cabin was a thin vein cut through hills of alder and spruce. County Road 14 was patched in places, gravel dragged at the edges, a narrow shoulder that turned the pulsing hum of travel into a soft, intermittent noise. I remember the check-in instructions were precise. Enter the code at the lockbox on the porch, carry the luggage left of the door, do not park on the driveway if you have a truck. The host, Jenna, had sent me a note an hour before arrival asking if I needed firewood and offering a number in case of emergency. The cabin itself felt like a postcard, log walls, a small stacked stone chimney, curtains the color of old linen. Sunlight slanted across the table when I opened the curtains, the air smelling like the faint metal of old nails and the sweeter tang of drying herbs. I made coffee in the metal percolator, and the sound of bubbling water filled the kitchen like a small machine breathing. The heat was slow to build in the wood stove, and I sat on the edge of the couch with my notebook, the leather warm under my thighs. I knew I had 4 full nights to write and slow the pulse back down from city speed. The first night, tired from the drive, I left the porch light on and slept with the window cracked a little for the sound of the forest. Sometime after midnight, I heard soft knocking at the back door. It was a polite pattern, 3 light taps followed by a pause, another 2. I went to the window and saw a silhouette moving at the edge of the deck, a hood and the outline of someone carrying a thermos. I opened the door and the man said, "Evening, I am Marcus. I do generator checkups up here sometimes. Lights went out at the Jensen place. You all right?" He had an old truck smell about him, motor oil and cigarette smoke, and he handed me a small card with a number written on it. On the app, the driver that picked me up earlier that day had a different name and a different face in the thumbnail. I asked why that was, and he laughed, a sound that tried to smooth my question, and said the app had old pictures. We spoke for 10 minutes about the cold settling in early this season, about where to buy donuts in town, about whether it was better to leave the porch light on. I told him I was staying for a few nights, and he nodded, gave me the card again, and walked up the lane, the thermos catching the porch light like a small moon. Block 2, the part I call routine and the slow comfort, stretched over the second and third day in Merrow Ridge, and then into the next cabin. I found a rhythm. Mornings of coffee that steamed like pale ghosts, afternoons of hiking a trail that ran along a creek with a stone footbridge, evenings of cutting and stacking wood behind the cabin that smelled of sawdust and wet bark. I started to write with more purpose. My host Jenna came by once, a compact woman with a ponytail who carried a clipboard and the kind of laugh that suggested everything was manageable. She introduced me to two locals, Elena and Sam. Elena ran the town diner and had a laugh like a bell. Sam worked at the hardware store and knew every bolt in the county. Between them, they told stories that felt like the town's weather, shifting and immediate. I met a mail carrier named Tom, who paused at the gate to ask if I wanted my mail held, and a woman named Laura who walked dogs and kept bees. Those were the small outlines of the community. The cabin, by contrast, was a private geometry of stacked wood, a lockbox, a key, and a thermos left on a hook in the pantry that I used each morning. The place was quiet, in that definitive way, where every sound becomes significant. A branch scraping the roof at night felt like a footstep. Cooking a simple meal made the space domestic. It felt like proof I belonged there, at least for a little while. I wrote a short piece, edited 3 interviews over a slow internet connection, and kept checking the messages in the app, a ritual that comforted me because it offered a paper trail for my movement. Jenna stopped by twice more, once to bring extra kindling and once to warn me that a storm might come from the west, heavy and sudden. Her warnings felt like an extra layer of neighborliness. I told her about Marcus, about a card and a different face in the app, and she frowned and said she had no record of a scheduled checkup. "Sometimes folks drive up here to sightsee," she said, "but if you ever feel uncomfortable, call me and I will come right over." Her promise was warm like her hands when she thrust a fresh thermos into my arms and left me with a list of local numbers pinned to the fridge. At this point in the story, I want to ask you, watching this, to pause and think about your own small moments of doubt when you travel. If you ever had a sense that something was off, even though nothing obvious was wrong, I want you to write about it in the comments. Start with, "I felt it when," or "This never happened to me," so others can skim and connect. If you remember a detail that made you uncomfortable, like a thermos left in an odd place, a pile of stones arranged just so, or a face that did not match a photo, include that. These small data points matter more than we realize. They create patterns others might recognize and maybe help someone avoid a harm. The comment section of these videos has become a place where people build a shared map of warning signs. When you do write, please be precise about the time, the smell, the weather if you can. Your memory may help someone else piece together something that seems like an isolated moment, but is actually part of a larger trend. After you drop that comment, keep reading, because these details connect in ways I did not expect when I started booking weekend escapes. Block 3 is where things change from benign to unsettling, with a neighbor who at first appears friendly and then reveals little incongruities. The incident happened on the second trip, the chalet near Hollow Creek, on November 2nd. I booked a late afternoon ride through the app from the bus terminal in a town called Greystone. The app showed a driver named Miguel with a blue Prius and a profile photo where he smiled widely. When I stepped into the pickup zone, a tall man in a flannel jacket waited. An older man named Harold, it turned out, thermos cupped in his hands like an offering. This scene unfolds in a dialogue that lasted much longer than the moment required. The exchanges were numerous and felt, at the time, like ordinary neighborly banter. I will write the conversation as it happened to preserve the texture of the encounter. I asked, "Are you Miguel from the app?" He answered, "Nah, Miguel is a young man. I used to drive him around when he was learning the roads." I asked how long he had lived in the county. He said, "Born and raised. Used to run a little repair shop over by Hollow Bridge." I asked why he had a thermos. He said, "Coffee. Old habit. Stops me from wasting money in town." I asked if he checked generators for folks. He said, "Sometimes. Folks around here have old systems that trip when the storms come." I asked where he had learned to fix things. He said, "From my father, from stubbornness, from needing to." I asked whether he had children. He paused and said, "One girl, Laura. She runs the bakery now, lives in town." I asked whether he knew Jenna from Marrow Ridge. He said, "Jenna? Sure. She buys wood from Sam at the depot." I asked whether the app ever had wrong photos. He said, apps sometimes lie. People lie more. I asked if he minded me checking the app profile against his face. He laughed and said, I do not mind. Folks these days prefer pictures to conversation. I asked what had happened with the Jensen place he had mentioned the week before. He lowered his voice and said, windows boarded up since the winter. Lives there sometimes, sometimes not. Folks don't talk much about it. That last phrase lodged in me like a splinter. His face was weathered, his hands rough and inked with grease. He was friendly, but his knowledge of places and people sketched a map that overlapped with other details I had been collecting. The exchanges continued, each question and answer revealing a texture of local history, and then a thin seam of something not quite matching the map in my head. By the time he left, I felt oddly reassured and oddly on edge at the same time, the dissonance working like a chord in a minor key. Block 4 built that dissonance into a series of small anomalies. At Hollow Creek, I began to notice physical signals that did not belong. The first was a pile of stones arranged near the trailhead, stacked in a deliberate, almost ritual way, each rock balanced on the next like a tiny monument. The second was a thermos left on a gatepost, its metal catching the morning sun like a deliberate punctuation. The third was a set of shoe prints in the mud that led to a window and stopped as if someone had leaned and looked in. I cataloged these items in my notebook: stones, thermos, prints. I took photographs from different angles so the images would capture light and shadow. Each image carried the sheen, evidence, but not of a crime. At least, not in the way we initially understand it. I also noticed scraps of paper pinned to trees on the trail with names written in hurried strokes. The sensory details were plentiful: the cold of wet bark under my palm, the metallic tang on the air when rain met an exposed nail, the whisper of mold in an old blanket left on a porch. These were the kinds of small things that usually slip by unnoticed, but when you keep seeing the same motifs, they start to feel like a language. I felt my chest constrict when I realized the thermos on the gatepost matched the one Marcus carried in Marrow Ridge, the one Harold had balanced in his hand. It was a small chain of objects that began to map a territory of human motion. At this stage, I also introduced more people into the story. I met Officer Reynolds from the county sheriff office, a calm woman with authoritative eyes who listened intently to my descriptions and took notes. I spoke with Deputy Carlos, who had worked in rural patrols for years and brought a scanner to the site to triangulate radio frequencies. I called the platform support and spoke with an agent named Priya, who sent me a standard confirmation email but conceded that identity mismatches could happen. I spoke again to Jenna, who now seemed uncertain about Marcus, and to Sam at the hardware store, who said he had seen a man in a blue jacket who asked about lost dogs and then took the road toward Hollow Creek. Each person added a brushstroke to a picture I could not finish on my own. The names repeated across the weeks: Jenna, Harold, Marcus, Elena, Sam, Officer Reynolds, Deputy Carlos, Priya. They moved in and out of scenes, each doing something specific, which made the narrative richer and more verifiable at the same time. These people were real, and their statements could be traced, which is why I began keeping a timeline with timestamps and screenshots. Block 5 is where the revelation happens, and with it, a moment of shock. On the third trip, the A-frame above Old Mill Road, I received a message from the host named Laura that made my stomach fall. She sent a photograph of a man on her porch taken from her home camera, a blurry figure with a thermos. The caption read, "This man has been here twice this week. We have no record." I compared the photo to the notes in my own phone. The face looked like the man who had introduced himself as Harold. I called Officer Reynolds and made a report. Her questions were methodical and practical. She asked for times, for screenshots, for the app's receipts. She asked whether the people I had spoken to were the same across the stays. When I told her about the thermos motif, she asked me to bring it in. If I could find one like it, to give it to forensics. The procedural description here is important and precise. The sheriff's office logged the report, opened an incident number, and assigned a deputy. They photographed the images I provided, checked host records, and cross-referenced local surveillance where available. The evidence was cataloged, labeled with an evidence tag, and placed into a secure locker for chain of custody. The deputy explained in plain terms that they would attempt to locate any relevant vehicles by checking license plate readers and speaking to neighbors. They advised me to secure my property, to avoid isolated places at night, and to forward any new images to the case file online. The technical steps felt bureaucratic and oddly comforting, a ritual that turned my unease into a trackable process. The shock was not just that someone had lied about their identity, it was that the same set of physical signs appeared in multiple places where I had stayed. Block 6 is the escalation, and the night the fear became more than a possibility. One evening at Lake Brant, a storm rolled in fast and the windows shimmered with the first sheets of rain. I had taken a final trip into town to buy a bag of rice and a candle, and, because the app was giving me trouble, I texted the host, a man named Nathan, to confirm the pickup time. The app showed a driver named Kelly in a small green sedan. When the car pulled up, it was a pickup, and a man in his 20s climbed out, soaked at the collar, and said he had been sent by the host. He introduced himself as Sam, which matched none of the app details. The dialogue that followed in the cabin that night is a key moment of tension and lasted longer than 12 exchanges, a back and forth that left my palms slick with sweat. I asked him, "Are you Kelly?" He answered, "No, Kelly is my cousin, works nights. I drove tonight because he had to work late." I asked, "Do you have an app receipt?" He said, "No, host told me to pick you up." I asked, "Which host?" He said, "Nathan, same as the booking." I asked, "Can I see the hosting message?" He said, "It was on paper, phone died." I asked, "Why are you soaking wet?" He said, "Car broke down, had to walk from the bridge." I asked, "Do you know Hollow Creek or Merrow Ridge?" He said, "I pass by sometimes. My cousin lives near the diner." I asked, "Do you have ID?" He said, "Left it in the truck." I asked, "Can I call the host?" He said, "Sure, go ahead." I called Nathan, and he sounded startled, said he had not arranged a ride, and told me to decline to go. Sam insisted with a smile that he was local and could show a shorter route that would save me time. In the heavy rain, it felt claustrophobic. The house seemed to shrink around us, the windows blurred by the storm into smears of white, and the sound of the shingles popped like distant firecrackers. That was a moment of tension where my mind flashed to 1,000 small possibilities. I remembered the training in situational awareness and decided not to get into the truck. I told him I would wait indoors and call him if I needed to. He left without protest, leaving a thermos on the stoop, warm and smelling of coffee. The thermos was another knot on the thread, and I bagged it as evidence mentally and physically, tucking the empty container in the trunk of my car before handing it over later. Block 7 recounts the arrival of external help and the official search for patterns. After the Lake Brant encounter, I drove to the county sheriff office and spoke to Deputy Carlos and Officer Reynolds at length. They requested copies of my screenshots, asked for times, and logged statements from the hosts. They checked license plate readers and ran checks on vehicle registrations in the surrounding counties. In this phase, the procedural description expands slightly to show credibility. The sheriff office documented calls in a standard format, creating incident logs under a central dispatch number. Officers canvassed neighborhoods and asked residents whether they had seen a blue-jacketed man or a pickup passing late at night. Forensics photographed the thermos and scanned for fingerprints and DNA where possible, noting that environmental exposure could compromise samples. The deputy explained the process of evidence submission to the regional lab, including chain of custody, timestamping, and secure packaging. They also noted the limitations. Cameras in rural areas are sparse, and many private hosts did not have cameras. The sheriff requested that I preserve the app screenshots and any messages. At this point, another name surfaced. A host in a neighboring township, Elena, told them she had found a backpack near a trailhead with a name tag inside. That backpack became a concrete piece of evidence. Officer Reynolds took possession and explained in clear terms that they would process the bag for prints, specifically noting how samples would be taken from straps and zippers and how they would log each item with a unique evidence number. The sheriff enlisted a state trooper to check highway traffic cameras for the dates in question. Meanwhile, the platform support said they would run an internal audit to see if unknown drivers were being flagged or if accounts were being shared. The collaborative movement from personal fear to institutional response felt like a turning point. The presence of names and official actions translated my string of anecdotal moments into an investigable pattern. Block 8 is the climax and the confrontation. It happened 3 nights after the Lake Brant incident when, during a windstorm that made the porch light strobe, someone banged on the door hard enough that the whole frame vibrated. My pulse folded. I peered through the peephole. And saw a silhouette that matched no app photo. I called Officer Reynolds on speaker, and the conversation that followed was long, loud, and direct. A series of exchanges that took up almost the whole hour. I will render the key parts of that dialogue so you can feel the rhythm of escalation. I asked through the phone, "Are you nearby?" She answered, "We are 5 minutes out. Do not open the door. Secure any pets. Keep lights on. Speak to the person through the door." I said into the door, "Who is there?" A man answered, voice low, "Hey, I am Sam. Looked like the lights were out. Thought I would ask if you want help with your generator." I said through the door, "We do not have a generator issue. Please step back." He said, "I just saw a light go out. I am worried about you." I said, "We have company coming. Please leave the property." He laughed softly and said, "No need to be curt. People in these parts are friendly. Open the door, Claire." I muttered into the phone, "He knows my name." Officer Reynolds said, "Does he have a thermos?" I whispered, "Yes, he does." The man on the porch began to call names of other locals, mixing them in a way that sounded rehearsed. "Tell him that Harold said the road is safe," he said. I replied through the door, "Who are you working for?" He said, "No one you know, just a neighbor." I felt a flash of memory of the pile of stones and a thermos gleaming at dawn. The wind made the porch light flicker, and for a second I saw the silhouette in the glass, the outline of hands restless at his sides. The deputy arrived and shone a bright light across his face. There was a pause, and the man swore softly. He dropped the thermos and stepped back. The deputy said, voice even, "Sir, keep your hands visible. You are trespassing." There was a flurry of movement, the sound of feet, then a quiet. The deputy and the man exchanged words I could not fully hear. When the deputy finished, he said to me, "We are going to take him in for questioning. Do you want to press for trespass?" I said, "Yes, I want him off the property." The man was escorted to a cruiser, and I watched, palms on the frame of the open door, as a pattern of stories that had seemed isolated came together into a person with a name and a set of movements across towns. The consequences were immediate. The man in custody turned out to have shared an account with several other phones, and while he denied certain allegations, he had a criminal record for minor property offenses. There was a feeling of relief that was complicated by the knowledge that I had come very close to a scenario that could have gone differently if I had been less cautious. Block 9 is the epilogue and the reflection where I unpack the aftermath and the lessons. In the month after the arrests, the sheriff office closed some threads and kept others open. 1 month later, I still checked the messages on my phone for new notifications from hosts. The immediate outcome was that the local sheriff charged the man with trespassing in multiple counties and lodged a pattern alert regarding identity misrepresentation through ride platforms. The platform pulled certain accounts pending investigation and adjusted its internal verification process in response to our reports. That first month was a mix of relief and insomnia, waking at odd hours to the sound of my own house settling. 3 months later, the case had moved forward. The man had been formally charged in county court. The prosecutors cited the corroborated statements of multiple hosts and the recovered backpack as evidence of a pattern. I spoke in a brief affidavit to the court, and the presence of multiple witnesses shifted the proceedings from a sometimes ambiguous dispute to a credible case of deceptive behavior. I found myself more cautious in small ways. I started taking screenshots differently, sending them to a friend before stepping into a car, and treating every ride like a small transaction with physical proof. 6 months on, the long view revealed something more complicated. The man pled to reduced charges in a plea agreement that required him to surrender vehicle privileges and to submit to community supervision. The platform introduced a new verification badge and encouraged hosts to add a check code to messages. My travel life adjusted. I still go to remote places, but I travel differently. I park in well-lit areas, I ask hosts to confirm ride receipts, and I keep emergency numbers pinned to the top of my phone. I learned that preparation is not paranoia. It is a set of small rituals that, when repeated, add up to survival. There are a few moments of tension that I want to name because they hold lessons. The first happened the night Marcus knocked at Merrow Ridge, the 3 light taps that could have been a neighborly request but felt like a test. In that moment, my memory flicked from a childhood of safety to the adult awareness of vulnerability, and I had to make a simple decision: open a small window to talk or keep the door bolted. I chose caution and a polite distance. The second moment came when Sam at Lake Brant asked to use my phone to call his sister. Phones are intimate objects that hold our lives. I refused and offered to call the host for him instead. And as I made that call, I realized my refusal was a quiet refusal to surrender control. The third moment was the loudest, when the man banged on my door during the windstorm, and the deputy's flashlight cut his face in half. I remember the scent of wet leather and the sound of the thermos hitting the porch like a punctuation. Each of these moments lasted a few seconds, but stretched out in memory like elastic, and each contained choices that were procedural but also moral. Throughout this process, certain objects repeated as motifs: thermos, a pile of stones, a backpack, a lockbox, a porch light. The thermos became the leitmotif, small and domestic, the thing that tied disparate nights together. The stones signified presence, a human mark in wilderness. The backpack was a literal carrier of identity, with a name tag inside that allowed authorities to follow a thread. When procedural steps were necessary, I followed them. I saved screenshots, I took photographs with timestamps, I kept messages, and I made audio notes for times and dates. When the sheriff requested items for evidence, I delivered them with a firm handshake and a sense of relief that practical acts can anchor fear to something that can be investigated. If you travel solo, there are practical steps I would recommend based on what I learned. Before you get into a ride, screenshot the driver name, the car model, and the plate. Share your trip with a friend through the app or via a message that includes the screenshots. Ask the driver to confirm the first name and compare it to the app before opening the door. If someone claims to be sent by a host, ask the host to send a confirmation number and verify that message through the app. Keep emergency numbers for the local sheriff and for the platform support in a prominent place on your phone. If you are staying in a remote cabin, opt for a porch light you can control remotely, and consider leaving the small radio on at night. And trust the little tightening in your chest. It is often a better early warning than you think. There are details I have not shared in earlier tellings because they felt small at the time, yet now seem significant. The man in custody had a tattoo on his left wrist, in the shape of an arrow. I noticed it in a frantic exchange at the porch light. The thermos he left had a faint scratch on the rim in the shape of a crescent. The backpack at Hollow Creek had a receipt from a gas station 50 miles away, dated the day before he appeared in 2 different towns. These are the kinds of facts that prosecutors like. They show movement and intent in a way that a single anecdote cannot. The host platform adjusted some of its internal flags after our complaint. They added an extra level for hosts to require a short code that the driver must provide at pickup, a method to match faces to accounts more reliably. It is not a perfect fix, but it helps. A month later, I drove past County Road 14 and slowed my speed when I reached the curve by the ritual of checking the rearview mirror, of touching my phone to make sure it was there, of keeping my hands on the wheel was now more habitual than it had been before. 3 months later, I gave a brief interview to a regional paper about the pattern, and the paper ran a sidebar that included tips for riders in rural areas. 6 months later, at a festival in a larger town, a host approached me and said, "Thank you, you made us think differently." I realized then that speaking up on small things can ripple outward. The world did not suddenly tilt to safety, but it offered small adjustments that made sense. If you want the practical cliff notes, keep screenshots, verify names aloud, ask hosts for pickup confirmation codes, and trust your instincts. Take photographs with timestamps of any physical anomalies you see. When you report to authorities, be precise with times and locations and keep copies of everything. The sheriff office will often need a narrative that places details in chronological order. That paperwork matters. Before I close, I will answer a question I get often. Did I ever feel unsafe enough to leave immediately? Yes. There were nights where I packed a bag and sat in my car until dawn because the sound of footsteps outside a cabin in the middle of the night is not the kind of thing that can be eased by logic. The practicalities of that are mundane but important. I drove to a well-lit parking lot, kept the receipts for gas and snacks as proof of movement, and called the sheriff to let them know exactly where I was. Those small acts of documentation and movement give you options later if you need to report. In conclusion, these 4 disturbing Uber trips were less about a single scary encounter and more about a pattern of small misalignments that, when traced, signaled a person moving through rural space in a way that was opportunistic and deceptive. The police took the cluster of reports seriously because multiple witnesses, physical items, and digital receipts made a case that one isolated report could not. The hosts adjusted practices, and the platform improved some verification steps. For me, the lingering lesson is this: prepare, document, and speak up. The thermos still sits at the back of my closet in a cardboard box labeled Evidence 1, a small domestic object that carries a memory of small discomforts turned into safety for others. The last thing I will say is simple. The world is full of helpful people, and sometimes of deceivers who use small kindnesses to mask larger intentions. When a face does not match a photo, when a thermos appears in multiple places, when someone knows your name before you give it, pay attention. Trust the tightening in your chest. If you have a story like this, or if you have tips for solo travelers about verifying rides in rural areas, please write them in the comments and start your reply with, "I felt it when," or "My tip is." Your notes help build a community map. If you found this story useful, consider subscribing for more verified accounts and procedural breakdowns. We are building a place where stories are checked, authorities are named, and practical steps are offered so you can travel more safely. Thanks for listening, and be careful out there. The silence on a country road may feel like protection, but sometimes it is just the prelude to someone knocking on your door.